I'm Mike Rosen. If you don't know who I am, I'm filling in for Pastor Dave, who is taking one of his children back to school as well. So pray for their safe travel and the safety to get back here next week. But it's great to be here because we're in a series entitled Nebuchadnezzar. And it was a challenging topic that I get to speak on today. And it's challenging because, as you know, it's how do you suffer well if you looked at the title and your faith under fire. And we know that because of Nebuchadnezzar, we get to see throughout how God still remains sovereign despite the circumstances that happen in our lives. He uses Nebuchadnezzar's life to show us that. And of course, David shared last week that Nebuchadnezzar is the rod of correction in Jesus' hand that we learned about last week. And today, I want to share with you that we're going to look at how does public pressure sway how you walk in your faith, and how do you handle when suffering comes your way. So we're going to dive right into, there's a lot of verses that I want to read through because I think it's important to understand, and we're in the book of Daniel chapter 3, and if you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles in the seats in front of you. Please take one of those. If you don't own one, we want you to have one. They're our gift to you from Hilltop because we want you to know about Jesus, period. So let's start in verse 14. It says, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the God's statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you've set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar said, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. This is the word of God. And just a little background. King Nebuchadnezzar lived around the 6th century BC, or other words, 600 years before Jesus came to earth. And Babylon was the preeminent power of the world. They were going around the nations, conquering different nations, and they finally landed on Israel and took over Israel. One of the things that Babylon did very smartly is that they would take the professional classes. They would take the artisans, and they would take the people, the scholars, people of government, the military officers, and they took these professional classes and had them live within Babylon. And the reason why they did this was a great strategy. It was to subjugate people. How do you subjugate them? You assimilate them. You have them become like you. And you know that countries would resist you when you get taken over. You don't want to follow. You're kind of forced to. But if you ultimately defeat them by making them more like you. And so they would take these professional classes, exile them, grow them up, and after a generation or two, they become just like them. And that was the strategy behind Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian culture, was for them to adopt the values and standards of Babylon. And so that they would lose their own distinct culture, values, and beliefs. And so this is what they actually were attempting to do against Israel. So we're looking today at three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were in a confrontation with King Nebuchadnezzar. And it's very famous. You may have already heard it. It's quite dramatic. But what it is great for is it teaches us how to journey through our lives today. And I want to suggest to you the first thing that we see is there's this pressure of what we call pluralism. We see that today. But what I mean by this, there's pressure when there's different religious, ethnic, racial, and political groups living together in a thriving society. Let's look at the top of that first passage in 14 when it says, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up?" Now, in the first part of chapter 3, which we didn't read, Nebuchadnezzar builds this giant image. It's 90 feet high, and it's made of pure gold. And he surrounds it with an orchestra. And he puts it in a very public space. And he gives this decree to the people that live there, that anybody that was in this public space that could see the image, when the instruments play, the orchestra played, they were to bow down and worship this image. You had to bow down. And of course, we saw from the passage that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just wouldn't do that. And the decree also said if you didn't do that, there were consequences. You were going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. So the first question I need to ask is, what did that image represent? When I was earlier in my walk with Jesus, I used to think that image represented Nebuchadnezzar. He wanted people to worship him, that he was the God. But actually, when we look at it, the question is, we're not given the actual name of it, but Nebuchadnezzar does give us a hint of who this image is or what this image represents. And he discloses it by the question that he proposes to the Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego. And it's in verse 14 when he says that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship. And that word "or" could actually be translated "by." The Hebrew word, it can be either or by. The translators we happen to read today said "or." But if you translate it and look at it and say, "Is it true, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods by worshiping the image of gold I have set up?" So that statement, what it tells us then, that image of gold didn't represent a god. It didn't represent Nebuchadnezzar. It actually represented all the gods of Babylon, all the values, beliefs, and the culture of the city. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar knew that he has this multicultural, multinational, pluralistic city that he's ruling over. So people from different places, different beliefs, different religious backgrounds, and he's saying to the people, you're going to worship this image. You are going to worship this image. But he's also saying that you can worship whatever image you want, but that's going to be private. When you're in public, you're going to worship this image. So he's allowing for everybody to worship in the way they want to, but not when you're in public. You're going to worship this, what we believe in, what this culture says. And what he's doing is he's privatizing their faith. And what I mean by that, we see that even today, the values. We learned that there's lots of cities that still look like what Babylon was in that day. We have pluralistic societies and cities. Not just Babylon and ancient Rome, but we can look at today's cities, London, New York, LA, Paris. You go around and they put the same kind of pressure on us. All pluralistic cities basically say this: you can privately worship the God that you want to, but publicly, you better be like everybody else. They're telling us that you don't get the right to have exclusive claims on your religion. Privately, you can do what you want, but publicly, you better be like everybody else. And that's how pluralistic societies work. And it strives, what it's doing is, it's great. The devil assimilating people to be like everybody else, and keep your faith private. So what does it look like today for us? Because everything that we read in the Bible, the thing we need to learn is, how does that affect me today? And I want to suggest to you that if you're a Christian, and let's say you're in a business world, and you're surrounded by people that are functioning a little bit ruthless in their business practices, maybe barely legal in what they're doing, and you're trying to be competitive, or let's say you're in a big corporation and you're trying to move up the ladder and people around you are doing things a little bit unscrupulous, the question I have is, if you're a Christian and you're a follower of Jesus Christ, do you become ruthless? Do you become barely legal? Do you follow what the other people are doing? Are you bowing down to the image, ultimately? Are you succumbing to the pressure that society gives you? You know, we're saying, if we're a Christian, that we believe and teach the attitudes and relationships that represent Jesus, but then when we live our lives, are we really living it to what we say what we believe in private? And so the question is, are you bowing? And all pluralistic societies, again, put this kind of pressure on us. But we see here in this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will have none of it. And just take for a moment, who were these guys? If you don't know who these guys were, they weren't some little holy huddle of young men, but we see them for the first time in chapter 2 when they're with Daniel themselves. And what we see is that they were deeply embedded in the culture. They were part of Babylon. They received an education from Babylon. They were working in the public service of Babylon. They were in government for Babylon. They were engaged and deeply embedded and involved with the city. And what they were doing is exactly what Jeremiah told the people of Israel to do in chapter 29 of Jeremiah, when he says, you love the city, you pray for the city, you seek the peace of the city, you work for the prosperity of the city, you engage with the culture and the economic activities of that city. But we see here, when you're asked to privatize and not speak about your faith, they're not going to have any of that. They say absolutely no way. They didn't care what the consequences were, and we might look at them as being somewhat brave. But I want to look at it from the perspective, again, how are we doing today? We are under the same kind of pressure. I don't know if you realize that, but we're under the same kind. If you don't recognize that you're under the same pressure, then you probably have given into that pressure. You're probably succumbed to the image. You're bowing down. And if you're not getting some sort of flack for being a follower of Jesus Christ, and you're never resisting, then you've bowed. And I challenge to you, are you resisting today? So remember, the first thing is we need to be confident and we need to stand firm in our faith. And we see also here Nebuchadnezzar gets quite angry because they're not bowing down. And what do we see them say? In verse 17 and verse 18 of this passage, probably the greatest declarations in the Bible uttered by any of the saints, says this: if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Now, this is confident faith. They are standing firm, and the first part of that declaration, when they say, we believe that our God is able to save us, he can save us and rescue us from your hand, they are not only saying that he can, but they actually believe that he will and that he wants to. And then they go on and say, but if he does not save them. And in that Hebrew word, it's literally, but if not. They're not going to bow down to the image. They're just not going to do it. So here's men of principle basically saying to Nebuchadnezzar, we serve and love God for himself. We serve for not what we get out of him. We serve and love God. We trust God because of who he is, period. We love him not just for what he gives us. And do you see this? In other words, do you have a heart that's completely undivided, so focused of a heart on God, so satisfied with God and just for being Jesus? Is that your kind of faith? Have you developed that kind of relationship with Jesus, to love him for himself? And I can't tell you, over the years when I've worked with people that say they trusted Jesus, say they believe in God, they'll tell me this: I trusted God. You know, I'm living this good life, and then I've just asked him to do something really important for me, and he doesn't come through. He didn't come through, and I was asking, I prayed, and I'm living this good life. And what I tell them usually is, you actually didn't trust God. What you had was God balled up in your agenda. You believed in what you wanted, and you were using God for that. The real hope, the real thing that mattered for you, the thing that you were really, really, really trusting in and hoping in was your agenda. And the thought that if I obey God and just pray to God, God will give me this agenda. And when the agenda didn't transpire, a lot of people just walk away from God. So are you really trusting God? Because here, you can, on this example, they weren't trusting God. They were trusting God plus something else. God plus this or God plus that. And if he comes through, great. But if he doesn't come through, you check out. You leave God. You see people leave the faith all the time. Maybe they had their own agenda. But if we see from this passage, just trust Jesus, period. Not God plus plus, but God himself. We need to obey him just because he is worth it. We trust him and we love him and we serve him for himself. Again, not for what we get out of him. And this is how precise their faith was. They are precisely believing in God, not God plus something. And as a result, they could handle anything because of that kind of faith. And in fact, behind that statement, that he will rescue us, but if not, it really doesn't matter. And something that every one of us probably knows is that God, if he chooses, he can save. We all believe that. He can choose us and rescue us from death. But today's passage, what I want you to see, and they realized, if you're a believer, God will always, not choose, but he will always rescue you through death. Do you see what I'm saying? The reason is if you die in Christ, you wake up in his arms. There is nothing but freedom, liberation, and joy that you get when you have a complete faith in Jesus Christ, and you are always safe. In Philippians 1:21, it says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. If you live, you live for Jesus. If you die, the gain is you're with Jesus. It's all about Jesus, period. So when these men said, we think our God is going to deliver us, but if not, we don't care. We're not going to bow down to this image. They had already won. They were spiritually fireproof from being thrown into this furnace. And spiritually fireproof, they could handle anything because they had this trust. And remember, it's not God plus something. And I want to encourage us today, one of the things we get out of this message is you can be fireproofed in whatever circumstance you're going through if you're going to be willing to be true and honest and precise in your faith, meaning that you're going to trust God for God himself and not God plus something else. It needs to be God for God himself and God alone. Another way you can actually look at this is we all want to be loved. I want to be loved, and not necessarily because you have money or because of your looks, because we all know that our money may fade away and our looks will definitely fade as we get older. But our hope and our desire is that people love us for who we are, right? Well, why should that be different for God? He wants you to love him for who he is, period. Which leads me to my final point, the one that will probably be most difficult for all of us. And we're going to look at the promises of suffering and what happens. You know, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious at these men. What happens? Well, he is white hot with fury and anger. And so he tells them to turn that furnace up 7 times hotter. And what does he do? He has his servants heat that fire up, and he has them bound up, thrown into the furnace. And it's so hot that it actually kills the soldiers that are throwing them in as they get near the heat. And Nebuchadnezzar goes to a place, though, a vantage point, where he can see what's taking place. And there are 2 shocking things that happen to him. The first thing I want you to see is that he sees the 3 guys walking around, just hanging out, walking around as if nothing happened. But yet, the soldiers that even got near the fire were dead. But these guys are walking around inside a furnace. And that's the first shocking thing. The second is he actually sees a 4th person. And Nebuchadnezzar is at a loss for words. The 4th one, he says, well, it looks like a son of a god, or the son of the gods. So we see that God has saved them, and they're rescued by God. And so what can we learn from this? Well, the Bible talks about furnaces, and it talks about fires, and that's a metaphor. Fire and furnaces are a metaphor for trials, suffering, and trouble. And what we're going to learn from this is that the rest of the Bible also teaches us things about suffering, and we need to know this because we're all going to experience suffering as we live in this world. So the first thing is suffering is inevitable. We see it throughout the Bible. Job chapter 5, verse 7 says this: people are born for trouble as readily as sparks fly up from a fire. And then we can look at 1 Peter 4:12, where it says, dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal or fiery trials that you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. And let me say this, of all the people in the world, we as Westerners, especially Americans, are the people that struggle the most with suffering. When I've gone around the world, when you go with other cultures, they expect suffering. Suffering is inevitable. But we as Americans, we feel like we need to blame somebody. We need to blame other things. I can't be suffering. This isn't right. If I'm suffering, something is going wrong. Now, people look at it from this perspective. A lot of people, particularly Christians, says, I'm living a good life. I'm trying. I'm doing things. I shouldn't be suffering. Why am I suffering? But think about that statement, how silly that statement is. If you're one of those that's ever gone through suffering and go, well, God, why me? Well, Jesus lived a perfect life. He was living a perfect life. What happened to him? He suffered tremendously. So why do we expect to get a pass? Recognize there are going to be furnaces in your life. There is going to be fires. You will walk through fires. So I want to suggest to you that you're either getting ready to go into a fire, or maybe right now you're in the fire, or hallelujah, God is getting you out of the fire. But that's how life works. We're either going in, or we're coming out. And so it teaches us, don't be surprised when it happens to you. Again, when I've worked with people, they're devastated and shocked that they even have to suffer. They're shocked at the fact that, hey, I shouldn't be doing this. I'm living this great life. And just think for a moment what's happened. I just think for what happened this summer in central Texas when the flash floods in the Guadalupe River hit the Camp Mystic, and you have 130 people dying in this sudden flood. It made no sense. 27 of them were children in this tragedy. And yet, I can tell you, when you read reports, the people that are getting through this suffering are the people that turn to Jesus and walk with Jesus and trust Jesus and proclaim his goodness and his sovereignty. So we need to recognize this. And the second thing that the Bible is going to promise to us about suffering that we get from these passages is if you believe in Jesus and you rest in him, then suffering will relate to your character like fire relates to gold. 1 Peter 1:7 says it like this: these trials will show that your faith is genuine. The trials are to show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. Through your faith, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold, so when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Your faith, that means your character, is like gold going through the fire. And what does fire do to gold? It's an intense experience, of course. It actually makes the gold better. It makes it more beautiful. It makes it more pure. So what does that mean? Well, if you want to know who you are, you want to know your heart, you want to recognize that you're going to make messes in your life as you go through this. You're going to make bad decisions as you walk through this life. You're going to have bad relationships. We all do. But how do we handle that? If we want to know what our heart's strengths are and our weaknesses, we need to have this kind of trials. And the second thing is, do you really want to be an empathetic, compassionate person and help someone else that is hurting or suffering? Well, do you want to have a profound trust in God so that you can really lean and put your weight on him? Do you want to be wise about life, which I think we all do? Then if you want those things, then you need to suffer. You won't get any of these things in life that I just mentioned without suffering. And I want to suggest there is no way to really know who you are until you're tested. There's no way to really learn how much you really trust God until you're drowning. And there's no way to really empathize and help others that are suffering unless you have suffered yourself. There is no way to become wise and know how life works until you're put in the crucible of suffering. Suffering, if you hold on to Jesus as you're going through it, it will relate to your character as fire relates to gold. And that's the second promise. And the third promise is even more important because some people may be thinking, well, does that mean I automatically, when I suffer, become a better person? And I'm going to tell you, absolutely no way. We all know plenty of people who have been broken and devastated through suffering. So how do you grow in your character and not become destroyed by suffering? And the answer is we need to know what these passages have told us today. Basically, it's saying, if you trust me, I will be with you in the furnace. And we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 43. It says, do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you go through deep waters or suffering, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty or suffering, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression or suffering, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you, for I am the Lord your God. He's saying here, I'm going to be with you. And this is not just God in general in these passages. The ones that was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar says he looks like the son of the gods. And the word that he uses for God is Elohim. And we see Elohim, God the creator, in Genesis. And Nebuchadnezzar does a pretty good job of nailing actually who this God is when he calls him the Son of God, because he also refers to him in verse 28 like this. He says, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted him. They defied the king's commands and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. He's not talking about any angel. The Old Testament has references to the angel of the Lord. And it's not like the angel Gabriel or other angels that came, and when they presented themselves, they said, God says this. But when we see the angel of the Lord show up, he speaks as if he is God himself. And I want to submit to you that this is who is in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We get to see God in a visible form. This we get to see as the pre-incarnated manifestation of Jesus himself. So how can you get yourself to the place where when you go through suffering, it will turn you into gold? It will make you more like Jesus instead of destroying you. Well, we need to understand and we need to feel that Jesus is there in the furnace with us, walking with us. Remember, he is, in Corinthians it says, he is the God of all comfort. He's going to be there when you're going through these trials. And think about it. Jesus himself went through the ultimate furnace for us. So we get to feel his presence when we go through smaller, cooler furnaces in this life. And what I mean when I say that he was in the ultimate furnace, well, think of what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. For those that don't know, Jesus was struggling there. And it says while he was in the garden, he was sweating. And we're told that he's sweating these great drops of blood because he was in so much agony. And what's that agony all about as he's in the garden? Well, Jonathan Edwards, a theologian from years past, has a great commentary on this. And he says it like this: Jesus had a near view of the furnace of the great divine wrath into which he was about to be cast. A furnace vastly more terrible than Nebuchadnezzar's furnace. Jesus was brought in the garden to a view where he saw the raging flames and the glowing heat so that he might know what he was about to suffer. This is what filled him with the sorrows and the darkness, this terrible sight, as it had overwhelmed him. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is that you and I, because we don't love God the way we should with all our heart, mind, soul, strength, or we don't love our neighbor as ourselves, we are the ones that deserve to be cast away from God. We deserve to be away from his presence forever when we die. But if that happens, because we were built for God's presence, if we lose God forever, that means ultimate agony. That is the ultimate furnace. That is hell. But Jesus Christ came to earth, lived the perfect life, died on the cross. He experienced the wrath that you and I should have deserved. And he was the one that was thrown into the ultimate furnace. And that's how we get saved. We believe in him, and none of that wrath comes upon us. So at the very end of that passage, Nebuchadnezzar also speaks very prophetically when he makes this statement: no God can save like this God. And he's right. There is no God that can save like this one. Let's look and think about other religions. Every other religion has a way to salvation that they claim. Every other religion's way to salvation is live a good life. Do this or do that, and God's going to save you. But think about what that does to you. If that is the way you believe in God, that you're going to get there by what you do, then what happens when suffering comes your way? Well, when suffering comes your way, you've been living a good life. You're either going to hate God because you're now having to go through this, or you're going to be in despair because you think, God, I just haven't done good enough. I should have been doing harder. You're going to get down on yourself. I haven't lived a good enough life, and so despair comes in. Every other God, every other religion gives you this way to salvation based on the works, based on your performance and your moral efforts. So if you go into the furnace with that kind of belief set, it's going to destroy you. You're either going to be mad at God, mad at yourself, or both. But if you remember the perspective that when you're going through suffering and thrown into a furnace, you have an opportunity now to sense and be in his presence with Jesus Christ. You get to say, I'm in a smaller, cooler furnace, and Jesus is right there with me. And we got to understand, you're not getting punished for anything you've done because he's already taken on your punishment. So remember, if we trust him in this furnace, then it's only going to make you better. You get two things. You're going to get better, you're going to become more like Jesus, and you get to experience Jesus himself. He suffered not that I would suffer, but that when I suffer, I become more like him. So we need to remember that Jesus Christ, being thrown into that ultimate furnace for you and for me, you get to sense his presence in our cooler, smaller furnace, and you get to be refined like gold. And there is no God that saves like this God. And then finally, what I want to share with you today is there's a modern-day Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, a little 12-year-old girl. I spoke about the floods in Texas at Camp Mystic. 27 kids lost their lives at that camp. This girl happened to be at that camp. And she could go into post-traumatic stress disorder, and she could go into anxiety and frustration. But this girl did what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They leaned into Jesus. She leaned into Jesus. She took the pain, what she saw, and all the struggles and heartaches that went around, and she went and took the song Hallelujah and changed the words and was doing it to help others and to praise God in the midst of the suffering that she endured. And I want to suggest to you that we can learn from this passage today, and we can learn from this little girl how to endure suffering. And we're going to just play this little clip for just a second.